In the last years, an Humboldt grant for experienced researchers allowed me to approach the important figure of Menecrate of Syracuse and then Philistion of Locri. I collected Testimonia and Fragments and published them with an historical commentary. As for Menecrates and Philistion, research on the physician Krateuas, who lived at the court of Mithridates VI Eupator, stopped at Wellman's studies. Almost a century ago, Wellman published two long articles. The first one dealt specifically with Krateuas, the second one on the authors of Herbaria, among which there was Krateuas too. At the beginning of 20th century, Wellman collected the Krateuas Testimonia and Fragmenta as appendix of the third volume of his edition of Dioscorides De Materia Medica in the slide. Wellman's two long articles and Fragmentesammlung, the Fragmentesammlung as a wide paraphrase, have been followed by a paper of Singer, but only partially. It deals specifically with Krateuas, and more recently by another one of González Castro, almost 20 years ago. Three specific studies in a century. All the remaining works on Krateuas are short encyclopedic entries, dictionary entries, citation, quotation in articles on different topic. For instance, Whiteman 7 years ago. They all offer some biographical information about life and career of this physician on the basis of the Testimonia and the Fragmenta collected by Bellman. But they do not deliver anything new on the Quelleforschung and on the historical, scientific, and cultural context in which Krateuas was trained, lived, and worked, or on the transmission of his works from the east, Kingdom of Pontus, to the west, Rome. Krateuas was an herbalist and is called roots picker by most of the sources. Probably he wrote a work entitled Herbal Rhizotomicon, in which the entries on plants included their synonyms, description, and a list of their medicinal properties. In the honor of his king, Krateuas called the plant Mithridatia, that was an efficacious antidote against poisons and magical practices. He also dealt with remedies extracted from metals, which, as in the case of his writing about medicinal botany, may have been part of an extended pharmacological work. Krateuas also wrote a popular herbal in which descriptions were associated to colored plates. On Krateuas, Wellman collected 32 testimonials and 10 fragmenta. Most of them derive from Pliny the Elder, Dioscorides, Galen, and from the scholiasts to Nicander, Teriaca, and Theocritus. After more than a century, Wellman's excellent edition appears nevertheless obsolete. Following the modern debate, it would be appropriate to check all the text using the new critical edition edition exempli grazia for Gallen, verify the nature of the quotation, testimonium or fragmentum, consider the feature of the quoting sources and the original narrative context in which we find the information, translate in modern languages, English or French, German, Italian, Spanish, etc., testimonia and fragmenta, completing them with a historical commentary, as the scholars currently use it to do in relation to fragmentary work, comedians, historians, physicians. If Wellman and Singer considered the legacy of Krateuas and its influence on Greek and Roman medicine and botany, in particular on Dioscorides, Pliny the Elder, and Scribonius Largus, nevertheless, we need to build, on the basis of the survived text, a portrait of Krateuas inserting this physician in a more precise historical and cultural background. In particular, we have to reconsider Krateuas, his professional training, his role at Mithridates' court, to recollect from new critical editions all the testimonia and fragmenta, completing them with the text that, despite they do not mention Krateuas, nevertheless, we can link to Krateuas' works and doctrine, to study testimonia and fragmenta from a historical perspective. In particular, the historical commentary, completely absent in Wellman edition, aims to raise the following questions. The teachers of Krateuas, the relationship between Krateuas and the Hellenistic medical school or other physicians who were in touch with Mithridates or lived at the royal court, the disciples of Krateuas, the influence of Krateuas on Mithridates. As for Menecrates and Philistion, the final aim is to publish a monograph on this physician. It will be divided in two parts. The first one will include a historical survey on the political and cultural context in which Krateuas was trained, lived and worked. The second one will contain testimonia and fragmenta, original text with critical apparatus and Italian translation. And finally, a historical commentary on testimonia and fragmenta. Perhaps a new monograph can shed some further light on Krateuas and his contribute to the development of Greek and Roman medicine and botany. As said, Wellman collected on Krateuas 32 testimonial and 10 fragmenta. Most of the testimonia comes from Pliny the Elder, Dioscorides, Galen, and the scholars to Theocritus and Nicander Teriaca. All the fragmenta come from the Codex Constantinopolitanus, said also Vienna Dioscurides or Juliana Aniciana Codex. Codex Constantinopolitanus and Codex Neapolitanus both include the work of Dioscorides organized in alphabetical order and accompanied by pictures of the plants. This reorganization in alphabetical order of Dioscorides' original work dated between 2nd and 4th century AD and is transmitted by the Guindobonensis archetype of Constantinopolitanus and Neapolitanus. Codex Constantinopolitanus quotes 10 fragmenta from Krateuas' work. This codex was composed at Constantinople about 511 AD in honor of the Princess Juliana Anicia, daughter of Anicius Olybrius, emperor of the Western Roman Empire. According to Wellman, who firstly formulated this hypothesis or conclusion, the Codex Constantinopolitanus copies the plant images from Krateuas' work. This hypothesis was followed by Singer, according to which this illustration that is from Juliana Anicia Codex, like the text which accompany them, are presumably copied from the older Krateuas herbal. If, as there is no reason to doubt, they come ultimately from Krateuas himself, then we can obtain a glimpse of his work in something like its original form. Is a citation, a quoting from Singer. In his edition, Wellman reports the main sources that mention Krateuas, signalizing, but without text, the other sources in which we can find a similar information. Here, for example, for instance, the main source for Testimonium 11 is the Scholiast to Theocritus. But Wellman cites also Dioscorides and Pliny the Elder. We found analogous procedure with reference to Testimonium 13, where the main sources is the Scholiast to Nicander, but Wellman cites Dioscorides, Pliny the Elder, Galen, and Oribasius too. In many cases, it would be appropriate to cite extensively after the main text the other sources too. They could complete the main sources and help the quelle function that is basic for an author in fragment as Krateuas. Sometimes the testimonium could be completed by other sources, even if they do not mention Krateuas, but we can be sure that they used the herbalist work. For instance, according to Pliny the Elder, Krateuas called a plant Mithridatia in honor of his king Mithridates. This testimonium seems to be clarified by a second place of Pliny, who, without mentioning Krateuas, therefore Wellman does not include it within Krateuas' Testimonia, insert the Mithridatia among the plants useful against the potions. Immediately after the Mithridatia, Pliny mentioned the Eupatoria, a second plant whose name honored Mithridates Eupator. This time, the Roman botanist does not cite Krateuas, but it is likely that the physician was author of both names, Mithridatia and Eupatoria. The few studies on Krateuas, in particular Bellman and Singer, focus on the medical knowledge of this physician and the use of his medical or botanical work by late sources as Dioscorides and Pliny. We need a more precise historical contextualization of Krateuas and his medical activities, in particular regarding the king Mithridates and his court. Even if I am presenting today only the first step of a long search, nevertheless now it's possible to say something new. In particular, we have to consider a notice from Dioscorides, who mentions a toxione from Pontus. The physician of Anabarzus does not specify his sources, but we can presume that this information can come from Mithridates' court and perhaps from Krateuas, whose work Dioscorides used and cited in many circumstances.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor Squillace. Are you using your slides? Because everyone seems to be seeing only the first slide.
The first slide? So?
It doesn't look like you've gone through your slides.
A moment. You see the PowerPoint?
We see the PowerPoint, but you're still on the first slide.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
So, it's okay? Is a problem with the... Okay. If Krateuas knew Pontus and its historical resources well, because it was part of Mithridates' kingdom, and in honor of Mithridates, called Mithridatias a plant that, according to Pliny, was efficacious against all kinds of poison, Mithridates, as we all know, was familiar with plants and potions and personally prepared an antidote named Mithridatium. Furthermore, according to Pliny, the king used to mix the blood of the Pontic ducks into his antidotes. Testimonies and Fragments collected by Bellman inform about Krateuas' medical writing and his activities at Mithridates' court, where it is likely he was the personal physician of the king or one of the medical royal staff. We know that Mithridates was in touch with famous physicians, Zopyrus of Alexandria, for instance, and Asclepiades. Because Mithridates' court was a place where medical and botanical knowledge circulated, we can presume that Krateuas was in touch with this physician too, benefited from their studies, and personally contributed to the development of botanical and medical knowledge in the court and in the kingdom through these works. After this first timid conclusion, we have to consider a second topic, the arriving of Krateuas' writing to the West, east to Rome. We don't know the precise chronology of the physician. Scholars are very generic. Pliny the Elder gives a first important notice. According to him, Pompey, after the success against Mithridates in 63 BC, took possession of the royal treasuries. There were also some notebooks. The king, who displayed the peculiar aptitude for inquiries into the medical arts, used to note down on them the results which upon experiment had been produced. Pompey gave these diaries to his freedman Linnaeus, the grammarian, and charged him to translate in Latin. If Pliny clearly attests the arrival to Rome of Mithridates' notebook, in which the king has assembled all his medical and botanical knowledge, in part or in large part learned by his physician, such as Asclepiades, Zopyrus, and of course Krateuas, a second place from Memnon of Heraclea give us a supplementary information. According to the historian, Clearchus, violent and egocentric tyrant of Heraclea in the 4th century, founded a library that made famous his tyranny. Under Mithridates, the library of Heraclea became the royal library, and it was accessible to the intellectuals of the royal court, such as the rhetoricians Metrodorus of Skepsis and the philosopher and rhetorician Diodorus of Adramyttion. Heraclea, around 17 years, was conquered by Lucullus, the Roman Lucullus, along with Amisus, Sinope, Cabeira, Pharnacia, and the entire Pontus. And the library fell into the hand of the Roman general. Moreover, a late source, just a moment, here, a late source, as like Isidorus, claims, even if generically, that we can read Rome primus librorum copiam ad vexist Aemilius Paulus perse Macedonum rege de victo de inde Lucullus e Pontica preda. In 1606, replaced by Pompey in the war against Mithridates, Lucullus returned to Rome and celebrated his triumph. And in a magnificent parade, he showed what he took to the enemy: prisoners, precious weapons, and golden statue of Mithridates, and money. The royal library was likely part of the booty. We are not able to know which and how many documents and books from Heraclea, and generally from the conquered Pontic cities, arrived to Rome in Lucullus' great library. That, according to the source, Greek intellectuals and important Roman figures such as Cicero were able to attend. In conclusion, I would like to mention quickly an issue that has not been raised before: the use of picture to illustrate the plants. If Krateuas could be the first in the field of botany, the first to use this method, before him others seem to employ this method in different research areas. The best instance seems to be Aristotle, who accompanied, this is during opinion, accompanied some of his zoological works with images. In particular, his Anatomiae, a work in 7 books, was perhaps provided with plates. The ancients used to describe into words what they did not know. For instance, we find this method applied by Theophrastus, who describes some exotic plants such as frankincense or myrrh, comparing them with similar trees of the Mediterranean. And this method we find in Pliny. Even if this was the most followed method, nevertheless, we have cases in which pictures visibly represent the Uno. For instance, the mythical griffon was depicted as Edian measure as ergued. As said at the beginning of this talk, because this search is at the first step, and I am involved in collecting and translating the text, I am presenting some fragmentary conclusions and, of course, many hypotheses. Even so, I can underline the originality and novelty of Krateuas' work. If the title of his writing, Rhizotomicon, is modeled on the work of Diocles of Caristus, the choice to depict the plants and to describe their medical properties, as Pliny says, seems to be fully new. Rightly, Singer called him the father of plant illustration, an author able to exercise great influence not only on the subsequent development of the herbal, but also on the course of the scientific botany. Many, many thanks.
Thank you very much. So we'll go to the next paper and we'll have the discussion at the end, as we did earlier this afternoon. We now go to, I am really sorry for murdering everyone's name, Maciej Kokoszko, who is going to talk to us about Anthimus on trutledoves, starlings, and bustards. Thank you very much. Sorry, you are on mute.
Hopefully now I can be heard.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So the title of the presentation is Anthimus on trutledoves, starlings, and bustards. The work by Anthimus, known as the Observatione Ciborum, is a collection of dietetic advice addressed to Theodoric, ruler of the Franks, who ruled between 511 and 534. It was composed in Vulgar Latin, most probably in the first part of the 6th century AD. Its author is said to have been a physician mentioned by Malchus of Philadelphia. He, on a charge of involvement in a plot against Emperor Zeno, was condemned to exile from Constantinople, most probably in 478. The doctor's late fate is uncertain, though it is believed, and this view is sponsored by those who follow Valentin Rose, the first editor and commentator of the work by Anthimus. So it is believed that Anthimus spent the remainder of his life among the gods. Subsequently, he was sent by Theodoric the Great as an envoy to the Frankish king Theodoric's court, carrying his work as a token of friendship. How, in fact, ungrounded turned out to be such conclusion has been proved fairly recently by Itzhak Hen, who suggests that the author of the Observatione Ciborum, after a short period of his stay with the gods, returned from his exile between 491 and 497 to the capital on Bosporus, and was sent at least on 2 diplomatic missions to the Franks by Byzantine Emperor Anastasius. Last but not least, Hen conjectures that Anthimus's work was commissioned by Theodoric himself instead of being composed at Theodoric the Great's instigation. Short as it may be, the Observatione Ciborum is a compelling work that can be interpreted from a number of perspectives. For historians of medicine, the text illustrates the evolution of dietetic thought and the development of materia medica before the 6th century AD. Historians of culinary art tend to analyze the treatise as belonging to the Mediterranean cuisine, while philologists perceive it as a fascinating material from which to explore the lexical richness and evolution of Latin. Interestingly, ancient historians classify the opusculum as a source written in late antiquity. Byzantinists recognize it as an example of early Byzantine thought, whereas medieval historians as a phenomenon belonging to the Merovingian world. The Observatione Ciborum contains 3 entries, 3 chapters, namely chapter 25, 26, and 33, which has been unsatisfactorily interpreted so far in terms of what they say about Anthimus's practice and fate. A starting point in the present analysis should be chapter 25, where Anthimus appears to make a reference to his medical practice when describing wildfowl. This is how we should probably interpret the words "istud et ego in tempore meo probabi in provincii mea," which are followed by a story of 2 peasants, duo rustici, who consumed the meat of a turtle dove, turtur, that fed inter alia on hellebore. It made one of them so sick that he suffered from internal hemorrhage and died. Anthimus adds that in such cases, aged wine, vinum vetus, and warm olive oil were the antidotes served to the patients, which is definitely in agreement with the medical theory of antiquity. Let us commence the analysis with information on the birds which eat hellebore. In the literature that Anthimus may have been familiar with, we come across a thread, but it refers to quails and not to turtle doves. In this context, quails are mentioned not only in the Plantis, a treatise ascribed to either Aristotle or Nicolaus of Damascus, but also in Pliny's Historia Naturalis, De Alimentorum Facultatibus, De Simplicium Medicamentorum Temperamentis ac Facultatibus, De Teriaca ad Pisonem, in Hippocratis Librum Sextum Epidemiarum Commentari by Galen, and in many, many other sources. Interestingly, the story on quails eating hellebore is often followed by accounts claiming that starlings eat hemlock, a fact which is also mentioned by Anthimus with data no different to what we can read elsewhere in chapter 26 of his work. Before the 6th century AD, it can be found in the Temperamentis, De Alimentorum Facultatibus, De Simplicium Medicamentorum Temperamentis ac Facultatibus, in Galen's De Teriaca ad Pisonem, and in many, many other sources. We cannot trace the journey these 2 pieces of information traveled to reach Anthimus's treatise. But what we can do is, especially when we consider his educational background, assume that he may have derived them from the repertory of medical texts. Anyway, it was Galen who statistically most often referred to the 2 facts in his treatises, and since he did so on the grounds of medical knowledge which Anthimus also studied, there is every likelihood that his works, I mean Galen's works, are and particularly the Elementorum Facultatibus and the Simplicium Medicamentorum Temperamentis ac Facultatibus, were the foundations of the system of knowledge presented in chapters 25 and 26. The reasons for Anthimus's substituting turtle dives for quails is unclear, and usually put down to the author's error. This is done, for instance, by Valentin Rose or by Carl de Roux. And the error happened perhaps to an effect of an inaccurate reconstruction of data that he, so I mean Anthimus, read in his studies in Constantinople, which he could not verify when compiling his treatise, as he may have had access, very limited access, to well-equipped libraries, for instance, in the region of Ravenna under the reign of Theodoric the Great, or in Metz, the capital of the Frankish ruler Theodoric. Either way, such interpretation could lead us to the conclusion that Anthimus had erred with regard to accepted knowledge, a mistake which might lead us to question his overall competences. Such a way of reasoning seems, however, to have its weaknesses. As a dietitian and gourmet, Anthimus was knowledgeable about foodstuffs, including fowl. Carl de Roux, who studied his letter in detail, has demonstrated Anthimus's competence in a number of his articles, never having been able to prove him wrong, except for this one and only case. As far as turtle doves and quails are concerned, they were ubiquitous in the Mediterranean and thus well known. The former nested across the areas of Europe, North Africa, and West Asia, which is reflected both in literary sources as well as by results of archaeological research. The latter cross the region twice a year, and their bones have been excavated in Italy, the Balkans, and North Africa. Accordingly, it should be assumed that the author of the observatione ciborum knew the creatures from his own experience and thus was able to tell one from the other. His topical competence is corroborated by the fact that it is impossible to demonstrate that Anthimus blunders when he refers to turtures, so to turtle doves, as a dietitian or gourmet. He was right that the birds, although they basically live in the wild, were also kept in captivity for fattening purposes. He was equally well informed about their dietetic influence, and in his evaluation followed in Galen's footsteps, who assessed them as hard-fleshed. The above characteristic resulted in their contribution to the production of black bile, which was also alluded to rightly by Anthimus. It is of the utmost importance that Galen's opinions were retained by later physicians who practiced up to the time when Anthimus was compiling his treatise, and that's why they are present in works by Oribasius and, of course, in Tetrabiblion by Aetius of Amida. One has, however, also admit that dietetic assessment of quails was not far from that of turtle doves. A good example is the fact that Archigenes of Apamea prescribed turtle doves and quail's meat to those suffering from dropsy because it was relatively dry. To be honest, quails did not attract Galen's attention almost at all, except for his testimony saying that they were hunted for and consumed in Greece, in Doris, Boeotia, Thessaly, and Attica, and that their meat could pose a threat to those who ate it. when the birds had a temporary fancy for hellebore. Galen's silence about the quality of the birds is, in fact, its assessment, the assessment of their meat, as if it had been a foodstuff regarded as worth pondering on, he would have not refrained from writing about it. In fact, we can conjecture that other medical doctors who were active after Galen shared his low appreciation of the meat. By the by, his opinion, Galen's opinion, had already had a long history when he was composing his works, and that is why Athanasius of Atalia, teaching on the birds, Athanasius' teachings on the birds are limited to a mere statement that quails were fattest, that means best to eat in autumn. In fact, Rufus of Ephesus, a fragment of whose work on diet appropriate for women has been preserved in writings attributed to Oribasius, is the other physician who, while classifying quails as the worst of all wild fowl, included to their dietetic characteristics, alluded to their dietetic characteristics, opining that the creature's meat moistens the body, but is not easy to concoct. It is easy to notice that Rufus's evaluation contradicts what Alcigenes claimed and is a clear sign of quail's double assessment in ancient medicine. On the other hand, apart from corroborating the validity of the above assumption, as for general quality of quails, Rufus's remark on their moistening qualities suggests that they were not assessed to contribute to the production of black bile, but rather to phlegm. In conclusion, the evidence presented above turns out to be important because it appears to prove that in chapter 25 of the De Observatione Ciborum, Anthimus did not make a mistake in naming the bird he was writing about, but as his description concerns a foodstuff which is melancholic and not phlegmatic, he made a choice in his teaching, and out of two pathways of medical tradition, he embarked on the one which was also favored by Rufus of Ephesus. Having said that, I would like to propose a solution to the riddle. First and foremost, one can venture a slightly different way of interpreting the meaning of the chapter 25. The beginning of the fragment, which reads, "De agrestibus vere avibus," suggests that its contents, the contents of the chapter, refer to wildfowl in general, and consequently, facts mentioned in the narrative consider all wild birds, of course, including turtle doves, but not only turtle doves. Accordingly, Anthimus's statement, worded "sicut auctoris nostri dicent," implies a mere fact that, as it is known from medical literature, if wild birds have a fancy for hellebore, their meat can pose a threat to the health of those who would like to consume it. What follows is a story which exemplifies these general teachings Anthimus learned from his reading, but on the basis of a case which proved the theory true. As a result, the story about treating the two rustici poisoned with turtle dove meat may well be a description of an actual intervention, which Anthimus made on the basis of correct therapeutic premises. Presumably, the fact that he knew medical sources that prevailingly reported food poisoning caused by quail meat entitled him to believe that he had encountered a similar case of course, in terms of its etiology, with much the same symptoms induced by another bird belonging to the same class. I mean, of course, turtledoves. Even though the case was not identical to the accounts he knew from the literature, he may still have come to the conclusion that the two poisoned peasants required the same standardized treatment with aged wine and olive oil. If this interpretation is accurate, chapter 25 should be recognized as evidence that Anthimus was not only an active but also a creative physician who, for instance, just like Galen, related his own professional experience in his writings. In all probability, he decided to add this information to tell the reader about his small contribution, which not only remained in line with medical theory, but was able to authenticate the content of his treatise, differentiating the observatione ciborum from works of medical theoreticians and authors who were not professional medical practitioners. Accordingly, one can modify the Roux conclusion expressed in his study on chapter 25 of the observatione ciborum, that the case was a mere verification of un savoir figé et éminemment livresque, and add that the described poisoning and its cure to other elements of Anthimus's creativity, rightly recognized in the Roux earlier articles. Although the story of the two poisoned rustici is not explicit enough for us to determine the exact time and place of the events, it still leaves leeway for speculation on the matter. First of all, there is terminus postquem, which relates to the general background of the story. Before his exile from Constantinople, as a city dweller, Anthimus mostly had contacts with residents of the capital, so with urbani and not rustici, while the fragment worded tortures in campo verqui nascuntur, and the profession of the poisoning victims allows us to conclude that chapter 25 tells us a story that is more likely to have happened in the countryside, that is, in a setting very different from that typical of the Byzantine capital. If so, the story is not a report from Anthimus's young years before the exile, but would rather refer to the period of his life when he was absent from the city upon the Bosporus. As a result, it must have taken place after 478, that is the year when he was forced to leave Constantinople. The words in villa duo rustici reveals that the author considers the two men poisoned with turtle dove meat to be either peasants or farm laborers who worked at a large mansion. They cannot have been better off, as if they were, they would have purchased fattened fowl, which was said to be better than the wild turtle dove they happened to catch. Neither could they have owned their own estate each, as the noun villa would then have been used in the plural, most likely with an additional possessive pronoun, for instance, in villi suis. If so, it seems reasonable to presume that the men could have afforded to pay neither for medical consultation nor for necessary medicaments, one of which, namely vinum vetus, would have been more expensive than regular table wine because of its maturity, and also due to the fact that it should have belonged to the class of top quality wines, as for instance Galen explains. Anthimus writes that he encountered the case during his time in Provincia Mea. Here, we may consider two possibilities for the situation to have happened. If we follow Valentin Rose's suggestion that Anthimus was a governor of one of the provinces in Theodoric the Great's Gothic state, the situation must have occurred most probably after 493, when the Gothic leader established his rule in Ravenna, as it was only after this date that the political situation in the kingdom of Theodoric the Great allowed farm laborers to lead a peaceful life and landowners to care about their stuff. On the other hand, provided we accept Itzhak Hen's hypothesis that Anthimus returned to the city on Bosporus between 491 and 497, stayed there for good, and was sent on diplomatic missions, the medical intervention is likely to have happened after the date, and provided Anthimus actually practiced as a medical doctor, being commissioned by landowners to treat either themselves or their staff. There is one more piece of evidence worth considering in the context of Anthimus's career. Notably, in chapter 33, Anthimus recommends to Theodoric bustards, saying that they were absent from Gaul. Since this piece of information implies that the author, while he was writing the observatione ciborum, lived in a place where bustards were hunted for and therefore appreciated as food, and since, according to the data collected, by Darcy Thompson, Lawrence Feinberg, and Geoffrey Arnott, bustards were in antiquity ubiquitous in the Balkans and to the east of the region, but there is no evidence that they were hunted for in the west, with the exception of Spain, or in the middle of the Mediterranean, with the exception of North Africa. It could be argued that the Observatione Ciborum was not compiled in Gothic Italy, but rather in the eastern part of the empire. It goes without saying that such conclusion supports Hen's hypothesis, which locates Anthimus for a longer period in the region of Constantinople, and disproves that of Rose and his followers, which implies that Anthimus stayed close to Theodoric the Great's court. If so, it may also become likelier that in chapter 25, Anthimus told us a story that happened somewhere. I'm very sorry. That happened somewhere in the countryside, but not that far from Constantinople, as the city was in the region inhabited by bustards. During the period between the beginning of the 90s of the 5th century AD and Anthimus's diplomatic mission to the Franks, during which he was carrying his final version of the work to Theodoric. Consequently, if we accept other results of Hen's lines of reasoning, the Observatione Ciborum was most probably completed also in a similar location after Anthimus's first encounter with the Franks, and possibly with Theodoric himself, who, having been impressed by Anthimus's competence in dietetics, commissioned the work, and it was in 508, before the hypothetical second legation, which might have been dispatched after Theodoric's enthronement, so after 511, and of course definitely prior to Theoderic's death in 534. Such course of events appears to be more congruous with pieces of information extant in Anthimus's work than that postulated by Rosse, whose ideas, though modified, were shared by Mark Grant, the translator of the text into English, suggesting that the Observatione Ciborum was compiled in northeastern Gaul and handed over to Theodoric by a Gothic legation sent by Theodoric the Great either in 516 or in 523. So, to recapitulate, the information in chapters 25, 26, and 33 of the treatise De Observatione Ciborum implied that the work was composed in the Constantinopolitan milieu after 508, possibly circa 511. Its contents entitle us to confirm the author's suggestion that the letter, I mean the work, possibly commissioned and dedicated to Theodoric, was based on the works by classics of ancient medicine. One can also maintain that Anthimus could competently and creatively apply in his medical practice theories he learned. Accordingly, he did not err when in chapter 25 he mentioned turtle doves, but his topical teachings were a creative application of knowledge he acquired through reading medical classics. His know-how included understanding the achievements of dietetics and was based on his fairly profound knowledge of materia medica, both of which, already recognized in the empire, were like spreading among Gothic elites. And this is basically all, and thank you all for attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very careful inquiry. It was very nice to hear about Calderu, who was my Latin lecturer, actually. We move now to, and again, I'm sorry for murdering names, Zofia Rzeźnicka, who is going to talk about Lepores, Verosi Novelli, it asked about connections between medicine and culinary art in Anthimus de Observatione Ciborum. So, Zofia.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah. Yes.
Great. Okay, so I will continue the analysis of Anthimus' treatise. However, in my presentation, I will examine chapter 13 of the Observatione Ciborum, discussing the preparation of ham meat in sweet and sour sauce. The recipe is worded as follows.
Sorry, Zofia, can I check that your camera is not turned on purpose, or?
Yes, because it's going crazy. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem, no problem.
But I left you the presentation by Professor Kokoszko, so you can look at the birds. So the recipe I would like to examine is worded as follows. Lepores verosi novelli, puerint et ipsi sumendi, indulci piper habente, parum cariopili et gingiber, costum et spicam nardi vel folium. Due to the time limit, I will only focus on the initial section of the recipe, which reads Lepores verosi novelli. Although the author did not provide us with any detailed advice on how to prepare the food, on the basis of other recipes requiring meat, taken from his treatise and other sources, we can try to reconstruct the status of the meat preparation. What is also important, this short passage gives us an insight into Anthimus's dietetic competences. In order to elaborate on the latter, I will start with presenting the most important characteristics of hair meat preserved in ancient and Byzantine medical works. One of the earliest remarks on the subject can be found in the Dieta, a treatise dating back to the late 5th and early 4th century BC, and constituting part of the so-called Corpus Hippocraticum. The laconic description of the text reveals that the meat is dry and slows down the excretory system, and yet it still has a mild diuretic effect. Slightly more information is provided by Galen. For instance, from the Alimentorum Facultatibus, we learn that consumption of hair meat thickens the blood and may disturb humoral balance, but to a lesser extent than beef and mutton. Later, the author compares hare and deer meat, most likely in order to imply that they are equally tough and hard to digest. Analysis of Byzantine medical treatises proves that subsequent generations of physicians used the data provided by Galen when describing hare's dietary properties. Hence, such authors as Oribasius, Etius of Amida, and Paul of Egina noted similar features of hare meat as those previously listed by the physician of Pergamon. One should emphasize here that since the meat was said to be tough and hard to digest, it was included by the Byzantine physicians in the catalogues containing products generating black bile, i.e. cold and dry juice, which was believed to be particularly thick and sticky. For this reason, it was thought to be difficult to remove from the body, and its excess was said to lead to internal blockages, which increased the capability of occurring various ailments. However, from the aforementioned words by Galen, we may conclude that hare meat was not as melancholic as beef and mutton, since it upset the humoral balance to a lesser degree. Therefore, it can be argued that it was not particularly harmful when eaten sporadically and in small amounts. Even though Anthimus provides no detailed characteristics of hare meat, some of his recommendations prove that he was perfectly aware of how its consumption impacts the human body. A clear evidence of his competence in dietetics are the chapters within the observatione ciborum, where he strongly recommends the meat of young animals, stating on a number of occasions that it is better than the meat of older ones. It is important for our deliberations that these observations concern not only novelli hares, but also lamb meat, goat kits, fawns, and young wild goats, i.e. in general animals whose meat was said to cause melancholy as they grow older. These remarks are a direct reference to the dietary doctrine contained, for instance, in Galen's De Alimentorum Facultatibus, where we can read that in the case of animals whose meat is dry by nature when mature, i.e. it can facilitate the production of black bile, it is more advisable to eat the meat from younger creatures, since their flesh contains more moisture. Thus, its consumption does not cause humoral imbalance. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that in the analyzed recipe, Anthimus recommends to use the meat of young hares. Presumably, the meat was exposed to heat treatment, but the exact method was not specified in the recipe. In order to gain greater insight into this question, we must turn into gastronomic literature. And one of the experts in arts culinary who covers the subject is Thanasis of Vela. And in his poem entitled The Patria, preserved by Thanasis of Naucratis, he states that hare meat is best when served hot and rare after being roasted on a skewer, only with the addition of salt. Thus, we can conclude that the author preferred hare meat to be roasted briefly and directly over an open fire. From the observatione ciborum, however, we can deduce that this technique would not earn Anthimus' approval, since in the chapters devoted to cooking mutton and boar meat, he definitely states that they should be subject to high temperature for a longer period of time and not too close to the fire. Otherwise, as he explains, the meat is done only on the outside when still raw inside. In other words, the outside becomes dry while the inside requires a lot of gastric heat to be digested, and as a result, meat roasted for a short time contributes to the production of humor that is dry and cold. As these recommendations refer to animals whose meat could be melancholic and thus of properties which can be at least to some extent similar to those of hair, we may assume that the latter should also be exposed to heat treatment long enough to make it tender and well done throughout. Even if such practices correspond in no way with the recommendations provided by Aristotle of Gela, it does not mean that they were not applied in the Mediterranean, because, as expressed by the author of Hedepatheia, there were numerous methods and advice on cooking hermit. The Greek poet's words are confirmed in a Latin compilation of recipes from the 4th century AD entitled the Culinary, where in chapter 8, book 8, we find 13 recipes devoted to hermit as well as accompanying sauces. Importantly, as many as 9 contain information on the ingredients of the said sauces, which include dates, raisins, boiled wine must, honey, straw wine, and plants, i.e. products that lie behind the dish's sweet taste. When we compare the data presented above with the recipe from the observatione ciborum for hermit served in dulci, we can conclude that there was a Mediterranean tradition of serving hermit in sweet sauces. Intriguingly, besides her, Anthimus also recommended sweet sauce for beef and peacock meat, i.e. foodstuffs whose nourishing properties were similar to those attributed to her. Additionally, a comparative analysis of both texts shows that beef and peacock meat were exposed to similar heat treatment, which may mean that her meat was prepared likewise. Taking into consideration the aforementioned recipes, information from the Observatione Ciborum, other relevant medical treatises, and the recipes found in the Colloquia, we can now strive to establish the manner in which Anthimus would have recommended to prepare the hermit. On the basis of accounts preserved by Oribesius, who states that wild game ought not to be cooked immediately after slaughter, we can conclude that it would undergo a process of tenderization. This recommendation was also likely to include hermit. Following on from this process, the meat was to be prepared, but we have no information whether it was also deboned. This recommendation appears in recipes presented in the Colloquia, but it is mentioned only twice, which implies that it wasn't a common practice. In addition, it was never recommended by Anthimus himself, so we may assume that it would not have been applied in the discussed case either. Presumably, the initial stage of meat processing involved blanching, as this was recommended in recipe number 1 in the Colloquia and in Anthimus' recipe for beef. Thus, the meat was most likely put into water. However, it was clearly an optional procedure, since recipes for beef and peacock meat in the Observatione Ciborum allow us to conclude that in the discussed case, stewing remained a major heat processing technique. When elaborating on the types of cooking processes for the meat in question, Anthimus recommends they be stewed in jus cellulum, which enable us to infer that it was a method he considered optimal for dry meats. The same technique is also suggested in the Recoquinaria. In recipe number 6 for exuolura herb, reads that the meat was to be stewed in olive oil, fish sauce, and stock. The author uses the term coctura, with the addition of pig, coriander, and dill. Even though we have no detailed data on the ingredients of the coctura, the aforementioned recipe number 1 hints that it might have been a meat stock made from boiled herb. In addition, from recipe number 13, we learn that the latter could be substituted with a mixture of water, wine, and fish sauce, spiced with mustard, dill, and a whole leek. Since antiquity, the ingredients mentioned above, and especially wine, fish sauce, and olive oil, were commonly used in the cuisine of the Mediterranean, so Anthimus must have been well familiar with them. However, it is important to note that in the observatione ciborum, the application of the first two is a rarity, and the vast majority of recipes recommended substituting them with other ingredients. So let us wonder now over the composition of the ustensil in which the Byzantine physicians would have possibly advised the reader to stew hermit. It seems highly unlikely that, just as in the Recoquinaria, it was based on wine, since the treatise leads to the conclusion that the Franks did not commonly use the beverage for cooking. In the Observatione Ciborum, we only find 5 remarks on wine, with just 2 referring to its application in food preparation. At the same time, Anthimus frequently recommends the use of vinegar in Ars Culinaria. For our deliberations, it is vital to remember that vinegar is the base of the ustensil in which the physician advised the reader to stew beef. Therefore, it seems he was perfectly aware that it would make the meat tender and thus easier to digest. Given this argument, there is every likelihood that the physician applied the same technique for hermit. Possibly, just like the authors of the recipes in the Recoquinaria, he would also opt for the ustensil to be slightly diluted with water or meat or vegetable-based stock to neutralize the taste of vinegar. The overwhelming majority of the sources for hermit in the Analyzed Cookery book contained olive oil, which allows us to presume that it was also listed by Anthimus in his recipe. After all, he recommends its application considerably more often than animal parts. On the basis of Anthimus' treatise, we can also assume that he would not use fish sauce, which was a standard ingredient ensuring the salty taste of almost all dishes in the Greco-Roman world. In fact, in the recipe for sucking pig, the physician strongly advised the reader against this ingredient, recommending salt instead. Therefore, it seems quite likely that he would use the latter to add flavor to the discussed itself. In all probability, it would also contain some plant-based ingredients to enhance the aroma and flavor the dish. On the basis of the information in the analyzed medical treatise, we can presume that this included celery, coriander, dill, and leek, since Anthimus considered these specific vegetables and herbs to be the best ingredients for cooked dishes. What further increases the probability of the said herbs being used in the analyzed recipe is the fact that, except for celery, they were all listed in the aforementioned recipes from the Recoquinaria. However, we should not exclude the use of celery, since it was recommended among the ingredients of the ustensil described in the Observatione Ciborum, which the physician recommended for stewing beef. From the same recipe, we also learn that the dish was spiced with fennel and pennyroyal. When we take into account the similar properties of both types of meats, we can presume that Anthimus would also consider the said ingredients as suitable for hermit. Although in the analyzed recipe the physician does not provide us with any data on how the dish should be heated, we may presume that, analogously to the method described in the chapter devoted to beef, it would be stewed over a low heat. One might suggest that the vessel was put on a tripod or gridiron, as both items kept the pot at a safe distance from the flames and prevented its content from burning. The food might have been heat processed for a longer time, what also corresponds with Anthimus's recommendations concerning the preparations of meat dishes. Moreover, the said technique warranted that the meat did not lose its natural moisture, thus it was justified from the perspective of dietetics. In conclusion, we may state that even though the analyzed recipe does not contain abundant details on the culinary techniques, it still allows us to perform a hypothetical reconstruction of the main principles of cooking meat when juxtaposed with other passages from the observatione ciborum and other source texts. Despite its brevity, the recipe also reveals some information on Anthimus's medical competences, since in the analyzed extract, as well as passages discussing types of meat, the author recommends the meat of young animals. The passage is not only an evidence of his familiarity with the principles of ars culinaria, but also it indicates that he followed teachings of Greek dietitians, recommending clearly that the discussed foodstuff, when compared to meat of older animals, should be neither excessively dry or tough, and therefore less likely to contribute to the formation of melancholic juices. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this exploration of food. So the final talk today is by several people, Nikos Tsivikis, Thanasis Sotiriou, Olga Karagiorgou, Ilias Anagnostakis, I'm really sorry, on the Vine Road between Bithynia and the East, production and consumption of the Amorian wine in the Middle Byzantine period. Whenever you're ready. Sorry, who will be speaking? Can you, sorry, Nikos, can you?
Nikos, could you please turn on your microphone? You should be able to do this.
Sorry, I don't know what the issue might be here.
I don't know. Nikos, please try to click the icon with the microphone.
Oh, great.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'm here. And I'm, hello everybody. So I'm changing, how do I change the slides? Just that.
Arrows.
Using arrows.
Arrows, yes.
Okay, I'm doing that. Just a moment. Up, down.
Left, right.
Left, right. I will get it. I will get it. I'm supposed to be competent on those things.
Okay, so maybe I'll try. Okay. So if you wish, I can change the slide.
Okay, that would be perfect. If you can do it, that would be perfect for me. Okay, so first of all, let me say that we're extremely happy to be part of this colloquium. We need to thank the conference organizers, our session organizer, and the Valdemar Ceran Research Center of the University of Lodz for hosting us. What we will be presenting today is part of an ongoing research project conducted by the four presenters coming from different disciplines with the title Wine Producing Installations in Byzantine Asia Minor, 7th to 9th century, the case of Amorion. This is hosted by the Academy of Athens and funded by the National Strategic Reference Framework of the Hellenic Government and the European Union. We are also much obliged to Amorion Excavation Project, its current director, our good friend Zeliha Demirel Gyokalp, professor of Anadolu University, and the previous director, Christopher Lightfoot, for providing access to the material of the excavation and the archive. Next slide, please. At the end of the 10th century, Leo, the Metropolitan of Synoda, sent a letter to the Byzantine emperor in which he described the environmental conditions prevailing in his diocese, located in Phrygia, on the western edge of the Anatolian plateau. He mentioned that the altitude and the short growing season made the cultivation of olive trees, vines, and wheat impossible. Also, he complained that the lack of the Mediterranean trilogy, wine, olive oil, and bread, made those who did not want to live like animals, consuming barley, hay, and chaff, to rely on imports from the neighboring coastal areas. Next slide, please. Leo's testimony is largely reproduced in scholarly literature when describing the geographical conditions of agricultural production in the Anatolian plateau during the Byzantine period. Thus, the area is generally portrayed as suitable mainly for stock raising, in contrast to the coastal zones, featuring cereal crops, vines, and olive groves. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, the image of the wineless plateau does not correspond to the data resulting from the excavation carried out in Amorion, a Byzantine city located almost at the same altitude as Synoda, 100 kilometers to the northeast. More specifically, over the last decades, archaeological research has unearthed a series of winemaking installations whose number and size implies extensive viticulture and the processing of large quantities of grapes. Next slide, please. In the lower walled city of Amorion, three distinct large trenches have been under exploration, two of them in the central area of the city and one in its western part. In all of them, there has been compelling evidence of uninterrupted urban life during the 7th to 9th centuries, with reuse and often transformation of pre-existing early Byzantine constructions. In all the trenches across the explored part of the lower city, 10 different installations connected with wine production have come to light as part of larger domestic units. The greatest number of them, 8, were excavated in a downtown neighborhood, what we call the enclosure trench. Next slide, please. These installations consist of two different types. A, grape treading floors, like the one on your left, and B, lever and screw wine presses, like the one on the right. These two different types of installations probably reflect also different phases in the winemaking process, as we know it from numerous other examples and anthropological studies. Next slide, please. 3 grape treading floor installations, 3 have been unearthed in Amorion so far, all of them inside the enclosure trench neighborhood, which, as we shall see, seems to have been dedicated almost entirely to wine production during the 7th and 8th century. The treading floors of Amorion can be described as shallow tanks, like the one you see on the slide, more like floors lined with strong hydraulic mortar that drained liquids through conduits, here stone conduits, into deep collection basins. The best preserved one was found in the enclosure near the center of the city. This was a large, almost rectangular, close to 3 by 2 meters, treading floor with 2 stone spouts on its eastern side that led the drained liquid to deep collection vats. Waterproofed again with hydraulic mortar. The importance of these underlying logistics concerning the construction is implied by the made-to-order single stone slab that lines the eastern side of the linos, the main treading area, the one you see on the right. Certainly a newly quarried slab and one of the largest stone elements found in Amorion in Byzantine early medieval layers. Next slide, please. However, the most common wine-producing installation in Amorion, represented by 7 different excavated examples, is the otherwise not so widely attested lever and screw type wine press. Technologically speaking, this was a rather sophisticated contraption used during the second stage of the winemaking process, when the pulp and skins of the first treading were pressed to extract the remaining must. The function of such a press is better illustrated in the example that came to light again in the downtown neighborhood of the enclosure. The massive stones that you can see on upper left served as counterweights for the press machinery, and a long wooden beam pivoted on a pin set inside the dowel holes on the inner side of the 2 posts was pulled down by the weights. Next slide, please. Here it's much simpler. The installation worked by the lever principle, squeezing the pulp under a wooden pressboard that fitted inside the large mortared tank, or even some smaller wooden tank within. The must, firstly collected in a small hypolineon, usually placed in the central axis of the much larger linos, was then transferred manually into large clay vessels in order to ferment. Next slide, please. The wine installations of Amorion occupy the ground floor or the semi-basement of 2-storied buildings whose upper floor had a domestic use, as clearly indicated by the relevant finds. These buildings included spaces for processing, you can see tools, and storing foodstuff, or keeping animals. You can see one trough for feeding animals, probably. The date of construction and use of the Amorion wine installations can be determined fairly well based on the detailed archaeological stratigraphy of the ongoing excavation. Their appearance should be placed in the second half of the 7th century, when the urban fabric of the city starts losing its late antique character. Next slide, please. One of the most decisive dating indicators is the easily identifiable and consistent layer of destruction that has been found across much of the interior of the walled city. This destruction layer has been dated in the mid-9th century, and a large body of archaeological evidence suggests that it was caused by the Arab siege and sack of the city of Amorion in 838 by the army of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutassim. The remains trapped in this destruction layer provide us with a clear picture of how the city of Amorion evolved from the 7th until the middle of the 9th century. And within these remains, we find the wine installation. Next slide, please. This allows us to accurately reconstruct life and work in the downtown wine-producing neighborhood of Amorion, as can be seen in this artistic rendering based on the archaeological finds. Next slide, please. As noted already, the wine-producing installations in Amorion occupied even more than an entire city neighborhood. One more wine press has been found also in relationship with a nearby major church of the city. That would be Church A, the picture you see on the right. And another one in a neighborhood in the west part of the city, near the walls. That would be lower left. That is the large building trench. The frequency of the discovered installations, along with surface finds of large screw weights, like the one top left, in other parts of the city, suggests that there probably were many more wine-related productive facilities in the 7th to 9th century Amorion. This situation inside an urban environment is not common. Usually the presses, and in many cases the warehouses, the cellars with the wine jars, were in or near the vineyards. But in our case, the grapes need to be transported in carriages or in baskets loaded on pack animals inside the city, probably from the surrounding area. Next slide, please. The surrounding area of Amorion, immediate and wider, is indeed fertile and suitable for the cultivation of vineyards. A well-watered plain extends to the north of Amorion, with evidence until today of occasional vineyards, old vineyards. Also, in the immediate vicinity of Amorion, and as part of another project we run on the agricultural landscape, we have been able to reconstruct, even partially, field systems that probably come from the medieval times and might be related with actual Byzantine vineyards. You can see it on the picture on the right. But how can we actually understand this local production, this Amorian production, happening inside the city in a wider context of Byzantine history and society? Next slide, please. We know little about Amorion and its history until the 6th century. It was founded probably in the Hellenistic period, and in the Roman times it evolved into a medium regional center. Later, by the end of the early Byzantine period, it carried the basic features of a typical inland Anatolian town. It was a fortified, local, administrative, and ecclesiastical center, supported by a community which was characterized by social stratification and economic differentiation. However, the rapid expansion of Islam, next slide please, at the first half of the 7th century, transformed Amorion into one of the most important strongholds of the Byzantine Empire. The situation started changing rapidly for Amorion after 636, only 14 years after Hegira, when the Byzantine army in the east suffered a serious defeat by the Arabs at Yarmouk River, which led to significant territorial losses encompassing areas broadly corresponding to modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and northern Egypt. Next slide, please. After this great loss, the major Byzantine field armies that had been active against the Arabs in these regions were forced to withdraw behind the strong natural barrier of the Taurus and anti-Taurus ranges. As part of this relocation, the army of the East, the Anatoliki, occupied areas in the southern and central Asia Minor, and Amorion was gradually converted to a military camp and the base of their commander, the strategos. Next slide, please. After the middle of the 7th century, Amorion played a key role in Byzantium's struggle both against external as well as internal foes. Apart from the Muslim invaders, it is worth remembering that the army of the Anatoliki, together with the neighboring army of the Thrakisi, supported Emperor Constantine V, ruled from 741 to 775, against the usurpation of his brother-in-law Artavasdos, who even occupied Constantinople for more than a year. The constant presence of the Byzantine military elite and the successful defense against the invaders made contemporary Byzantines think of Amorion as the most eminent city after, or as, quote, the most eminent city after Constantinople, end of quote. Next slide, please. Amorion reached the peak of its importance. Amorion reached the peak of its importance in the first half of the 9th century. In 820, a local military man became emperor of Byzantium and established a dynasty that is known as the Amorian dynasty. However, less than 20 years later, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutasim launched a campaign against the native city of the emperor, and as it was mentioned earlier, he sacked it and captured the inhabitants. After that, the settlement was rebuilt, but it never gained its previous glory. Next slide, please. The choice of the Byzantine government to transform Amorion into an important military base has been attributed mainly to its strategic location, astride the main highway connecting Constantinople with a new front line. However, John Halton, who studied the process of the relocation of the Byzantine army in Anatolia after the Battle of Yarmouk, has proposed that we should comprehend it as part of a, quote, well-thought-out plan through which the empire could continue to maintain and support substantial numbers of troops, end of quote. In other words, one of the main reasons that transformed Amorion into a major military base was the ability of the city and its hinterland to provide for the army. At this point, it is worth remembering that the number of the soldiers of the Anatoliki has been calculated to circa 10,000 men. If Halton's hypothesis is correct, we can easily imagine the pressure that these large field armies would have exercised on the local communities and their resources. Under such circumstances, a well-orchestrated effort on behalf of the state, aiming to maximize local produce, especially of those kinds that were directly necessary for the well-being and the sustainability of the fighting force of the armies, makes perfect sense. Next slide, please. During the 8th century, this function was undertaken by a specialized fiscal bureau, the so-called imperial Colloquia. The presence of this bureau in the Anatoliki and the date of its activities are attested by their lead seals, which used to authenticate and secure their correspondence with the capital. These coin-like carte de visite carry on their obverse the portraits of the ruling emperors, while a legend on the reverse offers the area of jurisdiction of the bureau, Anatoliki in our case, and the year of office. Next slide, please. The Tacticon research project at the Academy of Athens, which studies the prosopography and administrative structure of the Byzantine themata, based on sigillographic and non-sigillographic sources, has brought together 7 such seals of the imperial Colloquia of the Anatoliki, dated exactly between 734 and 776, probably active in Amorion. Next slide, please. The information on the large number of soldiers stationed in Anatolia and the presence of the Bureau of the Imperial Colloquia in the Anatoliki, which denotes the serious imperial concern for the constant and sufficient provisioning of its armed forces during a period of constant warfare, indicates clearly that the wine-producing installations excavated at Amorion can be linked to and interpreted as part of a centrally devised plan on behalf of the Byzantine government to support this exceptionally large army force that was settled in central Anatolia around 650. Having established a connection between the presence of the army and the wine production in Amorion, the next question arises. What kind of wine was produced in the city, in the installations we saw? Next slide, please. First of all, we can state with some safety that most of the wine produced at Amorion must have been red wine. Mortar samples with wine residues from the vats of the wine presses, which were analyzed at the Department of Scientific Research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, clearly indicated the predominant production of red wine, and also the existence of residues from grape juice, referring to the stage where the grapes were still being pressed inside the vats. Next slide, please. More exotically, occasional glass finds, like the one you see on the left, fragments probably of alembics, little known from Byzantine sites so far, recovered from the 838 destruction layer, raised the possibility that also some kind of distillation might have been happening in Amorion. Further on, and according to Arabic sources, sweet flag, Acorus calamus in Latin, Acoron in Greek, or aromatic reed, was systematically obtained by Arabs from Amorion, from the area of Amorion. We know that sweet flag was widely used as an additive in wine during antiquity due to its therapeutic properties. Thus, it is possible that wine producing in Amorion carried on the ancient tradition of seasoning wine with various additives and plants, a well-known practice for a number of famous wines that were produced in the wider area during late antiquity. Next slide, please. Phrygia, where Amorion is located, and nearby Lydia were famous in late antiquity for their branded wines, some also used for therapeutic purposes. This information is given by authors who came from the wider region of Asia Minor, such as Strabo and Galen, and others who had a direct relationship with the area, such as Orivasios, a medical writer and the personal physician of Emperor Julian, or Stephen Byzantius, who lived in the years of Emperor Justinian. For instance, Thmolos, the area of Thmolos, produced wine extensively used in medical recipes together with other ingredients, such as hellebore, saffron, and sweet flag. Likewise, Amblada, another nearby area, which Strabo places near the boundaries of Phrygia and Caria, produced wine that was exported and was used for medicinal purposes. Next slide, please. The use of wine in medicine connects it certainly with the army. A story from the life of Emperor Julian, delivered to us by Livanius, sheds light to this relationship. In 363, the emperor led a campaign against the Sasanian Empire and was wounded from a spear. His injured liver was treated by his personal physician, Oribasius, of Pergamum, who probably irrigated the wound with dark wine and applied the procedure known as gastrography. This story testifies to the importance of medical wine in the aftermath of a battle. However, another story, written 5 centuries later, underlines a different aspect of the relationship between the Byzantine army and wine. Next slide, please. According to the Chronicle of 811, Emperor Nikephoros I, in a campaign against the Bulgarians, defeated the army of Tsar Kram and captured his palace. To celebrate his victory, he opened the cellars and distributed wine to the soldiers, who became extremely drunk. As a result, the Bulgarians seized the opportunity to strike back, destroy the Byzantine army, and kill Nikephoros, whose skull, according to the legend, became the drinking cup of Kram. Thus, an arrogant emperor and a drunken army were destroyed because of the excessive consumption and the unwise use of wine in a campaign. Next slide, please. More detailed information concerning wine provision for the army in the campaigns can be found in a treatise traditionally attributed to Constantine Porphyrogenitus on imperial military expeditions, which reflects realities between the 8th and the 10th centuries. According to this text, the emperor and his army, when marching from Constantinople to Syria, were expected to consume local wines. Enchorios. These wines were obtained in 2 distinct qualities. The good wine, kalos sinos, which was delivered to the emperor and his courtiers, and the ordinary wine, which was destined for the common soldiers. Based on this information, we can make 2 reasonable assumptions. First, that the Amorian wine was one of the local wines, probably one of the local wines mastered in the process of the campaign towards the east. And secondly, that the local good wines secured by the protonotari for the emperor were equivalent in quality to the sweet imperial straw wine produced in the royal estates of Bithynia that he was used to. Therefore, we can conclude that a high-quality wine intended for the imperial elite could have been actually made in the wine installations of Amorion as part of the local production. This wine was probably produced following the Bithynian method of making sweet straw wine, a technique dictating that the grapes should be dried in the sun before being trodden and resulting in a heavy, deep red wine. The presence of acorus in the area makes it even more possible. Next slide, please. The daily consumption of this sweet red wine was considered by some ancient physicians as an unhealthy habit. For example, Psychrestos, a 5th century doctor, didn't approve the use of wine by persons suffering from gout or podagra. However, Leo the mathematician, a famous intellectual of the 9th century, in a symptotic epigram, for the first time after 3 centuries of symptotic silence, reevaluated the wine as a vital element of the human diet and a major therapeutic practice. At this point, it is worth remembering that gout was considered an imperial disease and that the Byzantine emperors had easier access to sweet and aromatic drinks, like the straw Bithynian type wine, which was probably produced also in Amorion. Next slide, please. Maybe it was this exceptional red wine that filled the cup of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mutasim when he destroyed Amorion. According to an Arabic poem, an astrological prediction had foretold that his triumph would come at a time when the grapes ripen. Thus, when the victorious Caliph sat on top of the ruins of Amorion, he ordered his steward to pour him a drink, saying, "Bring the cup. Now the drink rejoices." Interesting to see a similar Arabic, fragments of a similar Arabic cup from the excavation from the 838 destruction layer that you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention. This would be all.
Thank you very much. So we have a little bit of time for questions. So if the speakers could come back to the room. Giuseppe?
Yes, please, for a moment. On, so I will mute myself, but I will be here.
Okay. So who would like to start asking questions? Sorry, I'm having very bad internet connection at the moment, so I'm not helping. I guess I'll start with a question for Nikos. Thank you very much. So that alembic, so do you think it was for creating perfumes, alcohol, for alchemy? Do you have any indication what it might have been used for?
Okay, and I see there is another question also. Alembics are very hot, they are actually boiling. So we don't have any idea. It would be great to have even the faintest idea of how it was used. Actually, it is a relatively new identification among our glass finds, and because these kind of spouts, so this is very technical, it's difficult to say if they are alembics or they are for, how do you call them, the hot, I don't remember in English, you know, the medical treating the...
Cupping vessels.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, veduzes in Greek, that would be. So there is a big discussion. Now we are certain because of how they come they come down, that they are actually from alembics. In itself, it's quite interesting, because I cannot recall, and I haven't found any other Byzantine 9th century sites with finds like alembics. They are generally identified as an Arabic thing. So we're it's very early in our understanding. So actually, I cannot tell you what they would be used for. Just to hypothesize that they could also have some kind of distillation. Of course. Sorry, perfumes is always one of the most common things that we discuss was happening with Olympics.
Thank you. I think John Wilkins might want to ask a question, but there might be a limit on the number of speakers we can have. Is that right? John is typing. We might get the question at some point.
You should be able to turn on your microphone.
So John should be able to speak now, is that right?
Yes.
So John, if you can hear me, you can probably turn on your microphone now to ask a question.
And camera.
Sorry, I think we can turn to other questions whilst people type, or so are there other questions for?
I've sorted it out.
Great, thank you, John. Nice to see you.
I fear that Matthews has had to go away, and Giuseppe, so I can speak. That's very unfortunate.
Don't worry, I will turn back.
I thought they were some super presentations. I loved what Nikos said, and it was full of interesting ideas about wine and the army and wine in central Anatolia. It's absolutely brilliant presentation. But I actually had a question, not for Nikos, but for Matthews, about his birds. As I understand it, you think that Anthimus had the experience of turtle doves in Constantinople and bustards in the Eastern Empire as well. Is that right? Do you think he had any experience of birds when he was with the Franks in the West? Or because I think he has salmon, he has Western fish. Are you thinking that the birds are all Eastern birds? Just to clarify. I can't hear you. You haven't got your microphone on, I don't think.
So basically, you're right. Once again, coming back to Karl de Roo, yeah, he proved that salmon was known because it could migrate up the river, so it was known in the area close to Metz where Theodoric resided. As far as other birds are concerned, so I think that mainly he has something like experience of what's available there. That is why sometimes he says that there are birds or other things, like for instance, I don't remember caricus probably, which are not available here in Gaul. So that's why I think that first he must have been there, so say in 508, on his first mission. he met actually Theodoric, just like Hen suggested. And Theodoric commissioned, and he had like 3 years to prepare the work and doing his research, say, or memorizing something he experienced in Gaul. But he was writing in the region that had some peculiarities, say, and one of them was that it was the region in which bustards were quite popular and they were hunted for and they were known as food. So that's why he said that although there is a good bird which is called the bustard, you don't have it here. Yeah? Mm. And this is pre-assumption that while he was writing, he was in an area that was inhabited by bustards. And since bustards were present in Greece and basically in Balkans, so most probably he was writing after he returned from exile, say after 491, so after the death of Zeno, or say after 497. And this was exactly the time when he started, not when he started. This was exactly the location in which he was for a longer time. I'm not sure whether I explained what I meant, John.
No, that was it was very clear. Thank you. Yeah. I just have a bit of evidence in my mind that is completely anachronistic. And that is that people in Devon, in the UK, where I'm living at the moment, used to eat bustards until the 19th century.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what the evidence is for people not eating bustards in Metz in the 5th century AD. How do you know that the birds were not there and people were not eating them? It's an innocent question based on my ignorance, but how do you know that?
I know that because all ancient and early Byzantine sources, so late antique sources, do not report any bustards from this area. Basically, they note that there were bustards in Spain, and that they were in North Africa. And as well, they were in the Balkans, but they weren't, that means, for instance, in Italy. So if he had been in Italy for a longer time, he must have been familiar with that, and he wouldn't have said that. I just wanted to suggest that Hen's hypothesis is much likelier, because according to it, Anthimus was for a longer time in a location inhabited by bustards. And Italy definitely wasn't that location. So this disproves the whole idea of Anthimus being with Theodoric the Great for a longer time, serving even as his, Theodoric's doctor, and so on and so on and so on. Probably dying as well somewhere close to Ravenna. There is another evidence which I wouldn't like here to discuss, but say, if you suggest that he made a mistake, he was knowledgeable about something, but about something not. So I could presume that he could have checked whether bustards are, say, on the menu and they are evaluated. And they had been evaluated for a longer time, for instance, in Ravenna, which definitely was a center for medical studies. And of course, we can't prove that all works by Galen were there, especially those that are most important. However, there were people that were knowledgeable about materia medica. There was a rising interest in dietetics. So there must have been people that knew something about this. And if he had wanted to consult them, he probably had an opportunity to do it.
Thank you. That's a really interesting case in general about Anthimus. I find that quite persuasive. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Other questions for our speakers? I had a question for Giuseppe, actually, about the Pliny's account about the plants Mithridatea and Epatoria. So it was interesting. I hope Giuseppe is hearing what I'm saying. It was interesting that you said that you feel the two accounts are extracts from Krateuas. I do wonder, however, whether does it make sense to have two plants like that named after the same king? I've always wondered about this.
Sorry, it's late and my family called me. Yes, Pliny, from Pliny we have two different information. The first one is a testimonium in the Vellman edition, and is about the Mithridatia. Is this is sure is a testimonium from Krateuas, because Pliny quotes Krateuas, name Krateuas. The second information, in the second place, Pliny mentioned Mithridatia with his medical effect. But in this second place, he does not mention Krateuas. I think is the same. He used the same source. About the Eupatoria, in this third occasion, Pliny mentioned this plant, but not mention Krateuas. But we have we can I think this third information can comes from Krateuas, because the procedure is the same. Is a plant in honor of the king. Of course, I said my search is in the first phase, is the first step, and in this moment I'm collecting all the text from new edition, and I'm translating some of them, and of course today I gave some information and many hypotheses.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered.
No, that's great. Thank you. Any further questions? I realize it's very late for some people.
Yes.
It's earlier here. Can't see any questions in the chat. Oh, I think someone is typing. Yes, just thank you for the very interesting session. Well, if there are no further questions, I guess we can draw this to a close. Thank you very much for a very interesting session. I'm sorry there were some disturbances in my own room. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thank you.
So thank you so
all.
very much. Thank you. Thank you for your interest. Thank you so much.
Good evening.
Have a lovely evening. I hope.
Good evening from Italy.
The same to you.
Bye.
From Poland. Okay.
Thank you very much, and hope we will all see tomorrow at the same time.